This is a short introduction to the history of philosophy in politics. The significance of philosophy for political thought. And I'll start with the significance of political theory and philosophy, and then just do a brief overview of the history of how philosophers have thought about politics. So first then, politics and philosophy. All our major approaches and concepts and ideas in politics and political science are based in the development of political thought and theory. So political theory then is a subfield in political science, and it studies the ideas behind politics rather than the mechanics that drive it. So it's less empirical perhaps than some of the other fields, but no less significant. It extends from philosophy, so philosophia, the love of knowledge, and studies questions about existence and knowledge, ethics, justice, and morality based on logical reasoning. And the point here is, of course, that politics very much is driven by values, justice, ethics, and so on. So when we're making assumptions about human behavior and what types of goals that society should strive for through politics, that enters into the realm of philosophy. So then the method of political philosophy, connecting it to reality, if you will, it's done by posing answers to very profound questions. How to distribute benefits in society? What are benefits? What should be benefits? Who should have them? Why? What is the proper role for government? So answers to these questions are quite wide-ranging. Adam Smith and Karl Marx have very different ideas about the role of government in the economy and why government should have that role in the economy. And that's the approach then of political philosophy, to understand politics, to improve it, and to raise questions about the values that underpin politics. So a brief history then of political philosophy. We can think of many strands of political thought: Islamic, Chinese, Japanese, Mesoamerican, indigenous. Modern political science is deeply rooted in Western philosophy, stemming from Greek antiquity, and that can be critiqued. Mesopotamians and Egyptians also thought about politics before the Greeks did. No philosophical texts survive from that time, but we have other examples of texts that have implications here. So the Code of Hammurabi, for instance, is the first written laws of the world, and that tells us something about the values of that society. So if we go over then a brief history of Western philosophy, which remains to this day the basics of political thought in most political science curricula, we would start with the Greeks. Early thoughts about the nature of politics, the good life, and the role of government. Some questions then, what is justice, are still not really answered today. We can discuss justice, social justice, economic justice, and so on, but there is no consensus as of yet. Plato talked about what is right and how should government conduct itself. Aristotle discussed more the politics of the possible, how to best achieve a better political organization. And of course, they philosophized about the ideal government, the ideal state. Moving to medieval philosophy, it centered more about the role on religion rather than maybe human government. But Thomas of Aquinas, who introduced Aristotle and the scientific approach to the Christian world, did, by doing so, contribute to this discussion on the role of government by introducing, for instance, the deductive method. Start with a hypothesis and then move to the observations to seek support for the hypothesis. And that this is still a very important method in political science. In Renaissance thought, we are starting to see the reconnection to the empirical, if you will. It's a more secular approach to politics, and Machiavelli being one of the classics here, inspiring the school of political realism. And by that, in this context, one could say that he is centering on politics, how it really works from an empirical and perhaps cynical point of view, rather than how it should be, and giving advice based on sort of his view on how people will actually behave. Thomas Hobbes is one of the earliest conservative thinkers and looked at the nature and power of government to create stability, and Leviathan was a seminal piece of work on political thought of the era. When we come to more modern political thought, we can see that a lot of contemporary political ideas build on this era of philosophy, the Enlightenment era. We have prominent liberal thinkers like John Locke, who argue that all people are born as a blank slate and therefore are born equal, which is a very foundational thought for democracy, and introduced the ideas of negative rights, so that government should be constrained and should be limited because citizens have the right to be protected from government, because government can abuse its power. Adam Smith, this early liberal economic thinker, introduced the idea of laissez-faire economics and the invisible hand of the market. He was reacting very much to the mercantilist economic systems and policies of the day, where government had a very heavy hand in directing how the economy of the country, the state, should work. And a little bit later on, now we're really beyond Enlightenment, but building on those thoughts, John Stuart Mill, who argued about the importance of freedom of speech. Now all of these three have been really seminal in the building of liberal democracy as we know it. This era, in terms of philosophy and scientific philosophy, also saw the rise of rationalism. So empiricism, Karl Popper is much later than the other three gentlemen here, but he contributed to this system of thinking by building science on what is testable and falsifiable. You have a theory, can this theory conceivably be falsified? Then it is scientific. If a theory cannot be falsified, it is not scientific. That was what he argued. Karl Marx, who was earlier than Popper, argued, of course, presented his critique very much to Adam Smith and rise of capitalism, and argued in favor of the alternative system of socialism, and he built his scientific inquiry on deduction. He was less empirical than Popper, but still very much building on reason, rationality, logic. And if we move forward even further and get to the mid-60s and 1970s and so on, then we get to postmodern thought. There are lots of thinkers too who are associated with this stream of thought, but one who has had major impact on political science certainly would be Michel Foucault, who critiqued what we know and how we know it, and introduced the idea of social constructivism, a sociological and political theory that explains the interaction between individuals, their social groups, and their environment, and changed how we can think about power relations in society. And this constructivism then argues that knowledge is a function of power, and language shapes the understanding of the world. So can we have an objective truth? Probably not. Why? Because knowledge is a function of power. So when we say this is the truth, it is not just a statement about how the world works, but it is also an exercise of power. That's his argument. So then the question arises, is everything we know tainted by the way that we have come to know it? And when we say that we know something, do we really know it? Or are we simply asserting our power? And that's an important intervention into the idea and the paradigm, if you will, resting on more logical systems of thought that do not critique or do not problematize the system of accumulating knowledge itself. So he's very meta in that sense. And that's a brief introduction to political philosophy and political thought. Our opinions on what government should do depends greatly on our ideas about the nature of people and society, and we therefore have to be aware of where our ideas and where our values come from and how these values have been discussed in the past. Thank you.